Two men, both legends of the silver screen. Yet behind the cameras, they were enemies to the core. This wasn't the kind of Hollywood rivalry you read about in gossip columns. This was deep, personal. A clash of values, pride, and power that would simmer for decades, until one of them took his last breath without ever forgiving the other. And at the center of it all, Lee Van Cleef, a man who quietly built his career in the shadow of giants, only to find one shadow he could never stand beneath, John Wayne's. Lee Van Cleef didn't look like Hollywood royalty. There was nothing polished or golden about him, no all-American grin, no soft features. He was cut from harder stone. Born in the small town of Somerville, New Jersey, on January 9, 1925, he was raised under the watchful eye of a father who worked as a watchmaker. From him, Lee learned discipline, precision, and the value of doing things the right way, even if it took longer, even if it was harder. When World War II came, he didn't just serve, he endured. As a U.S. Navy radio operator in the thick of combat, he learned to stay calm under pressure, to read situations before they erupted, to keep his mind razor sharp. Those experiences would later become the unspoken weight behind every character he played. After the war, while others settled into quiet lives, Van Cleef went chasing something bigger. Hollywood didn't open its doors for him with fanfare. He had to kick them open, one small role at a time. A nameless cowboy, a background soldier, a silent henchman, with eyes that told a story before his mouth ever moved. He wasn't movie handsome, and that made him perfect. Casting directors didn't see a leading man, they saw danger. For years he was trapped in one role, the villain audiences loved to hate. But there was more to him than cold stares and quick draws. That truth went unnoticed, until director Sergio Leone saw what no one else had. Leone gave him for a few dollars more, and the good, the bad, and the ugly. Overnight, Van Cleef's villains became something different. Not just evil, but calculating, intelligent, and alive with an inner code. And yet, even as his name began to spread, there was a shadow he could never escape. A man who towered over the genre, who wore the crown of the Western hero for decades, John Wayne. To the world, Wayne was the embodiment of the West. To Van Cleef, he was everything wrong with Hollywood. But the first sparks between them wouldn't come from insults or politics. They started with something far more personal, the way each man believed a role should be played. In Hollywood's golden age of Westerns, the screen was big enough for both men. But their philosophies on acting were worlds apart. Lee Van Cleef was a craftsman. Every gesture, every pause, every flicker in his eyes was deliberate. He believed a role should be lived, not performed. His characters were built from the inside out, layered, flawed, unpredictable. John Wayne? He didn't transform. He was John Wayne in every film. The slow stride, the deep, deliberate drawl, the righteous cowboy who always stood on the side of the right kind of justice. It was an image the audience loved, but to Van Cleef it was acting without risk, safe, predictable, hollow. The industry rewarded Wayne's consistency with top billing, massive paydays, and the kind of influence most actors could only dream of. And that influence was dangerous. On set, Wayne was known for doing things his way, changing lines, reshaping scenes, bending scripts until they fit his familiar mold. To Van Cleef, this wasn't the art of storytelling. This was ego steering the ship. Their paths crossed in industry circles. But there was no warmth in those meetings. Van Cleef's reserved nature clashed with Wayne's dominating presence. And behind closed doors, Lee began to voice what he really thought. That Wayne wasn't an actor in the truest sense, but a brand, a walking poster for an outdated West that never truly existed. And the tension only grew, because this was more than a disagreement about craft. It was the first sign of a battle that would spill into politics, Hollywood power, and the very soul of the Western itself. And that battle would ignite in the most divisive arena of all, the politics of America in the 1960s and 70s. If their acting styles built a wall between them, politics turned it into a fortress. John Wayne wasn't just conservative. He was the voice of Hollywood conservatism. He waved the flag loudly, defended the Vietnam War without hesitation, and stood as a symbol of the America he believed in, one that refused to bend or question its own power. To millions, he was a hero. To Lee Van Cleef, he was a walking embodiment of everything he rejected. Van Cleef didn't shout his politics from the rooftops, but those close to him knew where he stood. He leaned toward progressive ideals. He saw the world in shades of gray, not in the black and white moral codes Wayne loved to portray. The counterculture movement of the 60s, the protests, the music, the questioning of authority, didn't frighten Van Cleef. He understood it, respected it, and that put him in direct opposition to Wayne's iron-fisted patriotism. The tension wasn't just professional anymore, it was personal. Every time Wayne made another speech about the real America, or slammed those who questioned the war, Van Cleef's blood boiled. To him, Wayne wasn't just wrong, he was dangerous. Dangerous because his influence was massive, his words carried weight, and millions saw him as a moral compass. And in Van Cleef's eyes, that compass was pointing in the wrong direction. Hollywood insiders whispered about the divide. It wasn't subtle. Whenever the two men found themselves in the same room, the air would tighten. A smile from Wayne could feel like a smirk. A polite nod from Van Cleef could feel like a challenge. Neither man needed to raise his voice. The disdain was written on their faces. And yet, politics was only one battlefield. Another, more painful source of resentment was brewing. One that cut to the heart of Van Cleef's struggle. The way Hollywood's power was divided, and how John Wayne always seemed to stand at the very top. And what came next would dig the knife even deeper. In the Hollywood of the mid-20th century, power wasn't just about talent. It was about who controlled the spotlight. And no one controlled it quite like John Wayne. He was more than a movie star. He was an institution. Studios bent to his will, scripts were rewritten to suit him, and producers lined up to secure his name above the title. For decades, the Western genre revolved around him like the sun, and everyone else was expected to orbit quietly in the background. For Lee Van Cleef, that was suffocating. He had clawed his way from obscurity, survived typecasting, and rebuilt his career after a car accident nearly ended it, only to discover that no matter how good his performance, he could never be the face of the genre as long as Wayne was on the throne. This wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating. Because Van Cleef knew he had something Wayne didn't: range. He could slip into the skin of a cunning outlaw, a weary lawman, or a morally conflicted bounty hunter without breaking stride. Wayne, in Van Cleef's eyes, was locked inside the same role, film after film, year after year. Yet Hollywood rewarded that sameness with riches and influence. It stung even more when Wayne used that influence to shape the industry. He wasn't shy about pushing for co-stars he approved of, or for storylines that reflected his worldview. If he didn't like the way something was going, he had the power to change it. Van Cleef? He had to take what he was given and make it work. And deep down, that imbalance left a scar. To Van Cleef, Wayne wasn't just a rival. He was the gatekeeper, standing between him and the recognition he had fought so hard to earn. But power plays weren't the only insult. What happened away from the cameras, in the private corners of Hollywood, would make the tension between them even more bitter. Because off-screen, John Wayne's treatment of Van Cleef would feel less like rivalry, and more like outright disrespect. If the rivalry on screen was fueled by craft and politics, what happened off-camera poured gasoline on the fire. John Wayne wasn't just a towering presence in film. He carried that same dominance into every room he walked into. He was loud, confident, and used to getting his way. Some admired it. Lee Van Cleef despised it. Wayne had a reputation for being the alpha at industry gatherings, the man who held court with booming stories and sharp jokes, some of which, more than once, came at Van Cleef's expense. To Wayne, maybe it was harmless banter. To Van Cleef, it was humiliation. He wasn't a man who played for laughs, especially not when the joke was aimed at him. Behind closed doors, Wayne could be even more cutting. Stories floated through Hollywood of Wayne, dismissing Van Cleef as just a character actor, someone good for filling the villain slot, but never worthy of carrying a picture. Those words burned. Van Cleef had spent years proving he was more than just the bad guy in the shadows, and to hear Wayne reduce him to a stereotype, it wasn't just insulting, It was infuriating. Van Cleef was reserved by nature. He wasn't one to pick public fights or make scenes. But he learned quickly to avoid the circles Wayne dominated. If Wayne was at a party, Van Cleef found a reason to leave early. If they crossed paths at an event, the exchange was cold, a curt nod, maybe a forced handshake, but never warmth. It was clear. Wayne didn't respect him, and Van Cleef didn't just dislike Wayne. He hated what he represented. And that hatred only deepened when their rivalry spilled onto the screen itself, into the very heart of the Western, where each man fought to define what the genre really stood for. And in that battle, there was no middle ground. The Western was more than just a film genre in the mid-20th century. It was America's mythology. And for years, John Wayne had been its undisputed hero. His West was clean, noble, and steeped in a black and white sense of morality. The good guys wore white hats, the bad guys wore black. Justice was swift, and the hero never questioned whether he was right. Lee Van Cleef didn't believe in that world. To him, the West was dirtier, bloodier, and far more complicated than Wayne's polished vision. The characters he brought to life in Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns were morally gray. Bounty hunters who could save your life one moment and betray you the next. His West didn't deal in fairy tales. It dealt in survival. Audiences could feel the difference. Wayne's films reassured them that heroes still existed. Van Cleef's films forced them to question whether anyone was truly a hero at all. And that contrast cut deep into their rivalry. Van Cleef believed his approach was honest, that it reflected the reality of human nature, flawed, unpredictable, and messy. Wayne's movies, in his eyes, were propaganda for an America that never truly existed. And Wayne? He saw Van Cleef's brand of Western as cynical, even un-American. The divide wasn't just creative, it was ideological. Every time Wayne stood tall in the saddle as the noble cowboy, it reminded Van Cleef of the Hollywood machine that chose image over truth. And every time Van Cleef squinted down the barrel of a gun in one of Leone's sweeping epics, it was a quiet act of rebellion against the myth Wayne had built. For the fans, it was just two styles of storytelling. For the men themselves, it was war. And for Van Cleef, that war never ended, not even in his final years. Because until his last breath, the bitterness toward Wayne never truly faded. By the late 1970s, Lee Van Cleef had carved out a legacy that was entirely his own. He was no longer just the villain in someone else's story. He was the face of an entire era of spaghetti westerns, a star who had taken his own path when Hollywood refused to open the front gate. Yet, even with his international fame, John Wayne's shadow still stretched long. Wayne remained the industry's untouchable icon until his death in 1979. For many, his passing marked the end of the classic Western. For Van Cleef, it was complicated. There were no public statements of mourning, no heartfelt tributes. Privately, those close to him said the animosity had never cooled. Not even time could blunt it. It wasn't about jealousy anymore. It was about principle. To Van Cleef, Wayne had represented the kind of Hollywood that closed doors on actors like him. The kind of Hollywood that rewarded image over craft, conformity over nuance. That wound ran deep, and it never healed. As the years wore on, Van Cleef's career shifted into television roles and action films, his health slowly eroding from past injuries and heart problems. But even in those final years, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity he always had, a man who never bowed to the industry's politics, even if it cost him. When Van Cleef died of a heart attack in 1989, at just 64 years old, fans remembered the steely eyes, the deliberate draw, and the characters that lived in the moral shadows of the West. But those who knew the man also remembered something else, that he went to his grave holding on to a grudge that had defined much of his career. And in the end, the feud with John Wayne wasn't just about two men. It was about two Americas, two Wests, two visions of what a hero should be. And the reality that not every fight gets resolved before the final curtain falls, because some rivalries are built to last forever. Lee Van Cleef and John Wayne will always stand as two towering figures of the Western, but their legacies ride in opposite directions. One was the polished symbol of a heroic America, larger than life and unshakable. The other was the sharp-edged gunslinger who thrived in the shadows, bringing to life characters who lived in the moral gray. Their feud wasn't built on petty jealousy. It was forged in deeper fires, a clash of values, of politics, of power, and of how truth should be told on screen. For Van Cleef, Wayne represented the Hollywood machine at its most rigid, a system that favored image over substance. For Wayne, Van Cleef's gritty realism was a departure from the idealism he believed the Western should embody. They never reconciled, never bridged the divide. And maybe that's why their stories still fascinate us. Because in that tension lies a bigger question. Which version of the West do we believe in? The spotless myth or the brutal reality? In the end, both men shaped the genre in ways that still echo through cinema. One built the dream, the other shattered it. And together, without ever meaning to, they ensured the Western would never be seen the same way again.